you as a CEO, you as a business advisor, you as a junior member of the team, you need to be indispensable to the team that you work on. And that comes from learning, giving good advice, and having that human impact and that empathy that allows you to communicate your ideas effectively and to be trusted. And ultimately, if you can do that, you're on the right path to a great communication strategy or a great career. It doesn't matter what it is, they apply the same way. And we forget that to our peril, I think.
Welcome to Building Brand Gravity. I'm Anne Green.
And I'm Steve Halsey.
And we're glad to be back with another episode. So Steve and I are both in the GNS New York City offices today. And fun fact, we are right above Macy's and Herald Square. And there is a lot of preparation going on for the annual Thanksgiving Day parade right now. Right, Steve?
Yep. So move over, Walt Disney World. Just try and walk in the street in front of our office. And I'll tell you one thing, Anne. If parade prep in New York teaches us anything, it's that big moments require big preparation. You think about it, the street closures, the staging of the barricades, to the grandstand construction, to the parking of all the video production trucks, and even just the sound checks that are going on an almost hourly basis. And it's a full sensory experience around here. But I think it really ties well into the theme that you're going to be covering with our guests today. That's really that all this rehearsing, refining, tightening of the production is so important because you've got to get it right in the moment.
Yeah, I'm really quite excited for today's episode, Steve, because I'm going to have an in-depth conversation with an expert on one of my favorite topics, which is media training and presentation skills training and speech coaching. So Benjamin Thiele-Long is joining the pod all the way from Cambridge in the UK to talk about his new book, which is titled, love the title, How to Be Utterly Brilliant at Public Speaking, Presentations, and Talking to the Media. And obviously, this is quite an evergreen topic in our space of communications and marketing. But in my mind, there's still, after all this time, not enough time spent, not by a long shot, on thinking seriously and proactively about building these satellite of skills that's needed to be effective in these areas. I mean, what's your take on that, Steve?
Well, I think we all want to be utterly brilliant. And a big part of that really starts with understanding that public speaking isn't a soft skill anymore, and it shouldn't be a soft skill. It really is a trust accelerator. It's a strategic differentiator. And leaders who have to manage a more complex, volatile environment with so many different audiences really need to master it. And I know we've referenced this in the past, but it really is a core competency that should be taught to MBAs. It can be as important as finance. It can be as important as understanding different aspects of marketing. So I think that's why your conversation with Benjamin is really important, because it's not just tips. It's really about how leaders show up credibly and with influence. What about you, Ann? You've been doing so much high-level media and speech coaching lately. What's most important for our audience to understand?
Yeah, I think for me, and I talked with Benjamin about this too, is it's so fascinating how siloed or divided these tracks were before. So media training on one side and then presentation skills or speech coaching on another. It's not to say they never crossed over, but in many cases, they were thought of as separate practices. You'd hire them in separately, et cetera, et cetera. Since COVID, I've been seeing it come together more, and it makes a lot of sense given the media landscape. I was excited to see Benjamin's book, and as I got to know him, because he has such a holistic view of this, not just in terms of combining media training and what we understand as speech coaching or core presentation skills, which to me are a little bit different orders of magnitude when you get from the basic skills to really coaching to be on a main stage, et cetera, but also his understanding of how it works in your personal life and your professional life. I loved that about it. The other thing I loved is that his book, which I'll get into with him as well, is very much like a handbook. You can open any page and get a lot of value. So I'm hoping that that's going to come across in the conversation.
And I'm sure it will. And the other thing I think is important to stress also is a lot of times people view media training, spokesperson, message training as check the box. I did it. I got my certificate. I'm good to go. And it really is a competency that needs to be revisited again and again to really keep yourself fresh. because I think what we're seeing is so many things, internal presentations, stakeholder briefings, media interviews, all really collapsing into very much the same competency. And that's why I'm so excited to have our listeners hear your conversation, because Benjamin has a way of really framing it up that you really understand. It's about building up that muscle memory so that you can show up consistently and confidently in every forum. And I think the timing couldn't be better.
Boy, I couldn't agree more. So with no further ado, let's get into my conversation with Benjamin. I'm so pleased to welcome to our podcast Benjamin Thiele-Long. Benjamin, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And we're here to see this exciting new book that you wrote, How to Be Utterly Brilliant at Public Speaking, Presenting, and Talking to the Media, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of media and presentation skills training and coaching. And one thing that's been interesting to me is I've seen those skill sets, which used to be very much siloed from each other, come more and more together, especially post-pandemic. So I'm going to be very excited to get into this with you. But your journey has been really interesting. So I think just so our audience has a sense, share a bit about that journey from law and communications and back to law and what you're working on now.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. And it's interesting place to start about that amalgamation, because when I think about my career, two very different careers in one sense, but a huge amount of similarity, which is what's always been the driving force. That's right. I started my career as a lawyer, as a barrister in the UK. I knew that was what I wanted to do since I was about 10 years old. I knew I wanted to be a criminal barrister, and that's what I did. And I was at the criminal bar for about a decade, just under. Mainly criminal work, a balance of financial crime as well as sort of serious, what we call high street crime in the UK. So you know, kind of offending, which meant essentially I was a courtroom advocate for those 10 years. So 99% of my time I was in court, either doing trials or advising people on issues for trial. And then I moved over into communications about 10 years ago, so then spent another decade in communications. That link was a really easy one, actually. There were quite a few of us in the criminal bar that actually made that transition around about the same time and joined some of those large agencies on issues and crisis management. As you can imagine, a lawyer's skill set fits very nicely with that. And so I really had the sort of the reverse trajectory with communications. Most people start as a generalist and become an issues and crisis. I started as an issues and crisis and became more of a generalist. And my decade in comms started in the UK, but very quickly moved over to the US, where I was in New York and then the West Coast. So more latterly, as part of that career, I ran the West Coast office for Cognito, which is an integrated communications agency, really doing financial professional services. I was then the managing director of financial communications at Ketchum, looking after a broad range of clients. And the last 3 years, I was in-house at Petco, based in San Diego, the hometown where I was living at that time, more latterly being the chief communications and ESG officer. And right at the late part of last year, made the decision to move back, and I'm now back in law full time, with an asterisk there being part-time, still working in an advisory capacity. So working with a few companies on comm strategies, working with a few different people and teams on public speaking or presenting or media training. So really, chapter 3 is the best of both worlds, as I see it, getting to do the things that I really enjoy and love, and getting to choose who I work with and what I do.
Yeah, my one of my partners, Steve Halsey, who hosts this podcast with me, was looking at your book and as I was preparing for this, and he's like, "Wow, you don't often see Crown Prosecutor and Petco on the same resume."
It's quite the mix, but I think you've sort of given me the segue, because the similarity between those two is remarkable, and it's really a question of how the book had been something I'd wanted to do for a while. I think mainly because so many people were fascinated by my background as a barrister and as an advocate and how that translated into communications. And I did find it put me at a bit of a competitive advantage, because if you introduce yourselves while you're in a comms agency as a barrister, people sort of take a second look, and then they sort of wonder, well, why? And then immediately, if you can cut to the chase about communications and how to speak and how to be an advocate, it becomes very clear the set of skills that I come with, that then translate. And particularly with Petco, at the time that I joined, fairly new leadership at that point 3 years ago, an important story that they wanted to tell in terms of becoming public again, it all married with a desire of an individual, with Ron as the CEO, to elevate the profile, but also as a company, how can we think about this very empirically, but also have a story, have some charm, have something that consumers are going to enjoy. And I was able to marry those two in a compelling way, and that was really an interesting proposition, but one that was a lot of fun to do.
No, it's been great to reflect on that, and I think being in America, how we understand practicing law. I mean, people understand there's prosecutors, litigators, but mostly they think of lawyers in a more generalistic way. So the difference between being a solicitor in the UK versus being a barrister and being at the bar, and how it is you're speaking, the persuasion. It's actually interesting watching so much get argued in front of the Supreme Court right now. I think that's getting a little bit more in the public sphere, but it's always interesting to me, and I'm sure you as well, to see how certain threads of things are understood, how they're reflected through the media, what seems to be landing and being absorbed. So I love you laying that out, and the fact that it's interesting to hear that people, as you would interact with them, would recognize, wow, I see the connection with that skill set. And that's what I wanted to bring out at the beginning here, which is that connection. And I think for me, and I really felt this in your book, and I want to get next to why you decided to write it. I have a sense of it, but I'd love you to share more, because that's not an easy endeavor, to take on. There's a lot of books and how-tos out there in the business world as well as the personal world. But for me, these skill sets of speaking, presenting, talking to the press, etc., talking to the people in our lives, any stakeholder, is so holistic, so symbiotic with everything we do. And I think one of the things I try to say to my trainees is the mindfulness and the active engagement you need to see. It's all around you all the time. There's examples of this everywhere, but people really don't pick up on that, and they don't see the connections. They're like, oh, well, I'm going to prep for this big presentation, but am I using those same skills in my daily life and business? But tell me, are some of these resonating with you relative to why you wrote this book?
Yes, I mean, just to pick up on that last point, the cues are around us all the time, every day. And one of the things that I was really quite, I would say, dogmatic on when I was in communications agencies were instilling this proactive nature in my teams to read, to watch, to see, to be a sponge, because the more that you see and absorb, whatever it is taken from, can inform a communication strategy, whether it is how do you make a technical message more appealing? How do you take a big story and make it a small one in one sense? All of these things are around us in what we read, whether we enjoy television programs, whether it's opera, whether it's book, it doesn't matter. They're all around. And this is why reading is such an important part of what we do. And we take time to do that. And the first agency I was at Pagefield, when I moved from law to comms, the first thing all of us did, regardless of our title or what level we were, everybody had tea and toast together, very British. We have tea and toast together, and we'd read through the newspapers, physical newspapers. And I can hear some millennials just sort of grabbing their brains going, what do you mean? But we did, and we would thumb through, but we would look at things like editorial tone. We would look at what stories being picked up in one outlet versus all of them. Is it a general interest story? Is it something more specific? You'd say, hey, Jim, aren't you working on this with your client? And that is such an informed process. It informs what we do. And I think that is part of the book. The part of the book is there to try and instill people and just to remind people that there is no one way of doing things. There are fundamentals, there are techniques, which I'm sure we'll come on to later in this conversation, that underpin. But just like architecture, not every building looks the same, but fundamentally there's principles of structure and geometry that make buildings stand up. It's really the same kind of principle. So if you get the structure right and the foundations, then you can be as creative as you would like. And why I wrote the book, and I genuinely mean this is not a money spinning exercise. This is me sharing the knowledge that I've been lucky enough to have. And I think that this is one of the most important things we can do as business leaders when we get to the top of our careers as running an agency or chief communications officer. I believe it is a fundamentally important role that we have, is sharing that knowledge that we've been gifted, not keeping it for ourselves. And I was incredibly lucky to work with some wonderful people in agencies that showed me and taught me things that I have carried forward, which I share in the book. I also recognized that as a barrister, I was incredibly lucky to be taught public speaking skills. I mean, most of us are not taught these skills. There's no courses at college or school that say how to talk well in a group or how to present a keynote or how to give a wedding speech or any of those things. We're just expected to know how to talk well in a group. And I think this is fundamentally why I hear so many people say, oh, I can never do that. I can never talk in front of a group. And this book is here to prove people wrong. I want to dispel that rumor, but I'm sharing all of the knowledge that I've gained over 20 plus years. And essentially, I'm sure a lot of people will be very cross with me for writing this book because I've distilled what one might get in a $3,000 presentation training seminar and put it into a $15 book. And that's very deliberate because this is sort of my way of sharing all of the benefits and the good knowledge that I've had to allow other people to apply it and be brilliant themselves.
I love that. I think there'll still be a business model just given not a lot of people are self-motivated, but I do, for those that are, I want to get into this in just a minute. This is so accessible and clear, but I want to double click, as the tech folks say, on something you said that is so real to me and been such a pet peeve and pain point, which is the lack of formal training or attention to that. And I used to notice it early on, and I hope this has changed. Like, let's take the MBA, for example, which is training chief executives, especially those that will end up in the C-suite, which are the individuals that folks like you and I are counseling. And it's truly the most senior executives that I still actively work with as, I'm going to own my skill enough to call myself a master media trainer. I've put in way more than 10,000 hours over 30 years. So when you look at the MBA line, of course, heavy on finance, operations, et cetera, but the communication skill piece of it and the formal skills, but also the soft skills and the emotional intelligence that's required to connect across stakeholders and take an issue that's perhaps very contentious and find the humanity and connection in it, find the shades of gray. I just think it's woefully underleveraged. And, for our young people, there's so much discussion today about AI and what are the careers of the future. And it's very interesting to hear a lot more discussion of the liberal arts, of connection, of emotional intelligence. And I feel like this fits right into that because this is the most essential way in which humans as a species connect outward and connect with each other,
It's true. I mean, we are, you can't deny the impact that technological changes have on society. I mean, we're talking right now about AI. Previous to that, it was the internet. Previous to that, it was other things. And AI is the most incredible tool, and the way that it is changing the world. I mean, you just look at the levels of investment that are being put into it. You don't get investment in companies that are doing things that are not going to change the world. And that really is what we're seeing. And I think New York Times had a fantastic article weekend just gone about the 16 billionaires that have been created through AI. That there is so much money being put there, and it will change the way that we live, and for the better. I'm not a tech denier by any stretch of the imagination, but what AI cannot do is it cannot counsel, it cannot give judgment, it cannot give perspective, it cannot create trust or reliability. And this is where we come in. It doesn't matter where you are at your career, whether you are the CEO of a company, probably a company that is wanting the trust of investors, consumers, or your employees, or whether you are just starting out your career in comms, wanting to get a foot on the ladder and be part of that team, advising those people. The way that you do that, of course, is by assimilating information. It is, of course, by learning. It is, of course, by using technology to your strengths. But ultimately, you've got to translate that into a dynamic of trust, one of reliability. Mike Mohan, who was the interim CEO of Petco, and he was the chief operating officer of Best Buy, used to just talk about the say-do ratio. Again, I put it in the book because it's such an important thing. Say you're going to do something, do it. Say that you've done it, do it. It's such an important part. And the way that we interact is so important that you essentially, the word that I keep coming back to is being indispensable. You as a CEO, you as a business advisor, you as a junior member of the team, you need to be indispensable to the team that you work on. And that comes from learning, giving good advice, and having that human impact and that empathy that allows you to communicate your ideas effectively and to be trusted. And ultimately, if you can do that, you're on the right path to a great communication strategy or a great career, doesn't matter what it is, they apply the same way. And we forget that to our peril, I think.
Yeah, I love you centering trust, I think, as one of the critical outcomes, which is a constant. You're constantly weaving and building that. As we know, you put a lot of trust equity in the bank and it can get wiped out right away. But this is a good segue to something I said earlier, which is when I was first learning media training, which was at Burson Marsteller in the early 90s, when it was the largest agency in the world. Obviously, Edelman took that title a while after that. And I was in the New York office, and that was the largest single office of any agency in the world, about 600 professionals. And they had a really robust media training group and some of the most incredible senior trainers that I got to observe. And then over time, I also started to observe presentation skills and speech coaching, which is some people did both. But in terms of when it was hired or contracted or brought in, it felt to me for decades quite distinct. Now, over time, to put it practically, no duh, I figured out how interrelated they were. But during COVID, what I really found was that these merged together. The virtual setting, but also the way media interactions are changing. Let's say the rise of even this medium, podcasting, or many of the executives I work with, they'll be doing a stage fireside chat with a reporter. So what is that? Is that a public speaking engagement or is that a media interview? It's actually both. It's very holistic. And I'm also seeing, I think, because again, the multi-channel nature of being a front-facing executive, so much more awareness of the full package. And that's why the holistic approach, when you literally have in your title, I'm looking at here at public speaking, presenting, and talking to the media, I'm like, bravo. So tell me why you have that view of a more holistic approach.
There are two parts to it. I think just picking up on the latter part is the ways in which we now communicate are disparate and changing and amorphous. And also, any business leader is now expected to do all of them at the same time. Gone are the days where typically your CFO might do the earnings call. They would never go on a media tour, and you do your active best to keep them out of the view of your employee base, and you have someone else do the town hall. That has changed. COVID I think accelerated the change that was already happening. But you take the modern CEO or CFO in today's world, in American company, publicly listed, you're doing 4 earnings calls. That means you're talking to investors. It means you're talking to employees. It means you're then probably doing some media, and then you're doing a town hall and some other things. And that town hall is probably hybrid. Those media opportunities are hybrid. All of those are happening now. And so you have to be a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. And I think in order to both be that speaker, but also be an advisor to that speaker, you have to be able to see around all those corners and think about what is the message and what is the consistent message and message points that we want to deliver to all of those audiences, but then how will we nuance them to the different audiences? And I think this is to your point about the AI versus the empathy. That's where we come in as advisors of how to tailor that message, whether it is the language you use or the anecdote. They have to be different. They absolutely have to. And, if you were to draw an analogy, I'm a big fan of tennis. And the fundamentals of tennis are tennis. The game is played in a certain way, but you can't tell me you play tennis on lawn at Wimbledon in the same way you do on a clay court, or the same way you might do in the rain. You have to adapt to the scenario you're given, but we have very few tennis players that say, well, I'll only play on clay court in the dry. You've got to be able to have that ability to maneuver. And so the more and more I thought about the book, in order to cover the different types of speaking event that we have and that we'll have, I wanted to make sure that we had fundamental principles so that the reader is not overwhelmed at trying to learn what appears to be a different technique for every scenario. Rather, what is the fundamental thing that if you get right, you will be as brilliant as you can be. And then, of course, adding a few tactical things for various scenarios. So podcasting, I include in there, talking on a panel, a competitive pitch, a keynote, a media interview. All of those things have slight nuances, and we know those as trainers. But what I didn't want everybody to think is, well, now I'm going to do a panel, I have to relearn everything. No, same things, but you might want to also add these various elements onto them. And I think that has to be the way that we are now, partly because we work in such an agile way. And secondly, you never know what call might come of saying, we need you on this podcast, or can you do a panel? And you have to do it at short notice. The ability to be agile is really, really important. And to be able to counsel that and prepare for that, I try and deal with in the book so that people do not feel overwhelmed. At any point, the book is trying to take all those things that will be overwhelming and simplify them in a way going, no, you got this. You got this. Think about it, apply it, go get them. That's really what the book is sort of morally meant to do to people.
I love that. And the fact is that there's a set of practices that you build over time. Some of them relate to the content, some of them relate to the voice, some of them relate to your body and how it all comes together depending on what medium you're in. And demystifying that is really critical. So you understand what those building blocks are, finding those moments of awkwardness that you have to push through. Like, what is the thing you do that's distracting? How is it that putting it all together feels awkward? So you can I talk about getting through the crucible to the other side, where you become more awkward to get more comfortable. But the other analogy I try to remind people of, especially with media interviews, because I find that when executives have been trained in the past, so I've had training, but it's been a while, I remind them that if you walk into a gym after not working out for quite a long time and you just go full out, you will injure yourself. You have to stretch those muscles, warm them up, build them up. And I think that's why it's important to understand these as a set of practices that you literally practice. There's art and science to it. There's the science of how the brain works, how the brain picks up information. And I want to get into some of that in a moment. But there's also the art of it, of what you're bringing to it of yourself. But that's why I love in your premise that it could be the CEO presenting on an earnings call or in front of their annual customer event, or it could be the person that has to stand up and give a toast at a wedding. And it really does amaze me how, and it goes back to something you said earlier, this tends to be such a primary fear for so many people. Those two things are, that idea of getting up and speaking. Of course, if the wedding toast is scary, then you're very far from doing something as high stakes as an earnings call. But the thing that I want to move to is what I'm calling form follows function. So when you go through the book, if you open any piece of it, it's just like this is a whole little chapter here. It's the ideas are short. They're presented quickly. They're presented in smaller bites. There's often both the principle behind it and the action you take, the practical skills, the literal how-to. How did you come to that form, and what are you trying to do with that? It's so different.
Well, thank you. That is why I wrote the book, because I wanted something very different. And this is not a knock on anyone who's written a book that is theory-based, but what I did not want is a book that had long chapters that you had to read through and wade through in order to get from the theory to, okay, so how do I apply it? The point of the book was to be, I kept on calling it a desk side guide. So when I was speaking to publishers before I selected LID, I was trying to explain this is a desk side guide. What I want people is, I want people to scribble over it. I want people to put post-it notes on it. I want people to deface it. I want people to make it something that they can't live without and is by their desk the whole time. And why I ended up publishing with LID, who I have to say have been amazing partners, is they got that part of it from the off. They're business publishers. They understood that the basic premise is I have something to teach them and I have the experience to do it. And the basic premise that this is a book for busy people, that if you're going to be public speaking, presenting, you're probably fairly high level, you're busy, you don't have time to wade through theory. You want to be able to pick up something and get to it. So that was the first step. The second step, and I have to say, the writing of the book was fairly swift. The editing of the book was the longer part of the process, which took the best part of the year, because I constantly wanted to go through it, applying Occam's razor all the time. What have I written myself that is waffle? And what do I really need to communicate quickly, succinctly, so the reader has something quick and succinct that they can apply that makes every page of the book worthwhile. And I think I even said it when I was doing the initial pitch. I really don't mind if somebody reads the book from cover to cover or opens it at one page, reads it and uses one skill that they can then apply. My promise to any reader of this book is you can open a single page, you will learn something new on that one page and can apply it, and that will immediately improve your ability. And so this was really the driving force behind the book, the way it was written. But then we got really focused with the team about the layout. We went through several sets of the layout, because they even said with an idea, oh, it's on the page and you have to turn it over to get to the conclusion. No, if it's on a double page, it's left and right. You will never have to turn a page to get to the conclusion of an idea that I'm trying to convey, or the idea will be on the left and a visual representation will be on the right. So you can really absorb it very quickly, even down to the font, the layout, the color. Simple things like that were really important, so that even people with dyslexia can find the book very easy to read and to digest. This was important, that this is an accessible book for everybody, number one. And number two, it was littered, and you and I have talked about this, littered with positive examples of how to apply it. Gone are the days in, these are all the things not to do. That is not helpful. That is not helpful when I'm busy and I've got to go on Bloomberg in 15 minutes time, or I've got to run a team meeting in 10. That is not helpful. What I got to do, how do I make it work for me, and how do I go get it? And that process was a long process, but the most joyful one for me, because seeing that come to life in a way that then is a physical book or an ebook or however people want to use it, that's the real joy, I think, in what I've kind of, my vision coming to life as to what I imagined, but also just partnering with Lyd to make that happen in a way that is exactly how, as I envisioned it on my first day that I thought it through.
I love the idea of making something truly accessible in all senses of the word. And that's a wonderful thing. And I think underrepresented and under thought of. The other thing I pick up from what you say is that, communicators, we can weave a lot of narratives very quickly. We tend to be verbal, communications focused, but perhaps what you took away from the law and also practice of a communications art form is that old phrase, less is more. How do you bring it down and bring it down? I remember, like you, I've got PowerPoints galore with tons of tips, and, I've got full trainings. If I'm going to train someone who's never encountered some of these concepts before, and you have to go back to fundamentals of how the media work, or what does it mean to be successful in presentations. But I remember years ago, for a very senior executive, I'm like, how do I put for media skills the most important things on a single page, so that if he or she were going to carry it around, it's just absolutely right down to the meat of it. And they can glance at it and take something away, just a reminder, because you can do trainings and then it fades away unless, as we said before, unless you're exercising that muscle. What are your 3 golden rules, Benjamin, that you start the book with?
The three golden rules,
and I've got them here.
These are things that I really thought, and these were rewritten probably about 25, 30 times, each of them, to make sure I got them really, really right. But the 3 golden rules are essentially 3 principles that I believe apply to every speaking scenario. And I really mean every speaking scenario, that if you do no more than apply these, you will improve what you have to do and probably make it the most impactful it can be. Golden rule is number 1. Very simply, communication is an audience-defined action. We have to think about who we're speaking to most of all, and that is the scenario, the audience, the size, what time of day you're talking, the level of experience. It can be all manner of things, but we forget that at our peril. And so many poor presentations that I've seen are by brilliant people that have just not tailored what they're saying to the audience they're speaking to. The second is persuasion achieves irresistible outcomes. I don't think that we spend enough time really thinking about the most important question of all, is why am I speaking in the first place? What is it that I'm trying to achieve? And quite candidly, I'm sure every leader or every listener on this podcast can imagine a team meeting that they've been in that's lasted 35 minutes or an hour or what have you, and they've got to the end of it and saying, what was that about? That is just a prime example of whoever was running that meeting just not thinking, what is the actual outcome we want to try and achieve, and really thinking about persuasion. And then number 3 is to set the path with a compelling narrative. If you have a set of ideas, they can be really, really strong. But if it is hard for your audience to work out how those points come together to your conclusion, you're making them do too much work, rather than thinking, what is the most straightforward way that I can explain this, not only for me to explain it, but for someone else to understand it. And again, this is really tying back what I think we think about in law all day, every day, and about persuasion and what is the most straightforward, common sense version of events that leads to the outcome that we want. Usually it's either to, in a jury trial, convict or not convict. If it is in a litigation, to come to a conclusion rather than going to litigation. It doesn't matter what it is, but we're trying to lay that path. And so what I put is these 3 golden rules. They're like your GPS. If you think about who are my audience, what is the outcome I want or the action that I want to achieve, and what's the narrative that will weave all these ideas together, you will automatically have a more persuasive, compelling, and brilliant set of talking points than if you didn't think about those things. And those golden rules, in my view, underpin everything we say or do. They've underpinned my prep for this podcast. They underpin what every CEO will think about in an earnings call, what anybody might even want to think about very simply in a wedding toast. Whatever the scenario, apply them. You will sharpen and hone your focus, because if you don't do that, the analogy is it's a magnet by a compass. You can get distracted by all manner of things rather than what am I going to talk about and how am I going to talk about them. That's really what it's all about.
I love the idea of starting with the audience. And the other thing I'd add to what you said is, what is that audience disposed to believe or to hear? And I think there's very little attention paid to that often because, I have a double consciousness as both a practitioner and a CEO now, an organizational leader, and my pond is a bit smaller than the large multinationals, but we still have a sizable workforce that's made up of different types of disciplines, and there's 2 agencies within our group, and there's different roles and ages, different levels of experience. And, I'm always trying to think about what are all these different stakeholders predisposed to hear from me. So it's something I try to speak with my trainees a lot and also my peers. The other thing I would pick up from what you said is I talk a lot with folks about what success looks like in speaking. And I try to make a distinction between they can accurately receive and hear what you're saying. And that has a lot to do with speed, articulation, pace, the overall formation of your content. Does it, I often talk about drop the breadcrumbs or follow the bouncing ball. But the second thing I talk about is, do they walk away with your most important point? Like if you were going to do the old, if they remember one thing, what would it be? Can you pass that test? And I think it goes to what you're saying, which is that clarity of narrative. So one of the things I find interesting as I work with executives, and they often ask this question, is what makes a truly great speaker or presenter or connector? And that it is subjective, right? But also when you're in the room or you're in their presence, even if it's like a one-on-one, it when you feel it, as different as those personalities or events might be. What are some of those things for you, Benjamin, that makes someone great versus just good or fine or not fine?
2 things. One is a bit more empirical. One is a bit more emotional. The first is the empirical one is, I think truly great speakers are those that are able to quickly and effectively adjust between different audiences and scenarios. I think if you get to the point where the message and the focus and what it is you want to talk about, but can go between an employee and a Bloomberg presenter or an investor and a customer, and be able to tailor what it is you have to say in the way you say it to that audience sort of quickly and nimbly, that is, to me, empirically a brilliant speaker. And there are certain people that can do that really, really well. I mean, Kristen Peck at Zoetis, Marvin Ellison at Lowe's, 2 just utterly brilliant people that no matter what scenario I see or listen to them in, they're hitting the nail on the head with the audience that they're speaking to in a way that is very natural as well. And I think that then comes to the second part, which is more of the emotional. For me, good speakers, good advocacy, good speaking is when you sort of almost get the speaker, but what they're saying just makes good sense. And I think that's sometimes it's quite hard to pin down exactly what that is, but you absolutely know it when you feel it. You know it because you're invested as a listener, and you get cues as a speaker to those things as well. this is why I think it's really important that we get our head out of our talking notes, and out of the screen and looking at the audience we're communicating. Look for visual cues, look for nods, look for agreement, look for employees looking energized. And to your point, business leaders at all levels will have challenging times in their career or in their business's career or their organization's career. And a lot of the time you'll take the stage in a difficult scenario where you're trying to remove fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And those are really good things. Those are good things that we can do as business leaders to make sure our employer, our customer base are calm or in a crisis scenario. But there also has to be more to that. You have to remove the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But what is the go-get? What is the solution? Have I set it out? Have I made it easy for you? Here's what I expect from you as the business leader, and here's how I'm going to help you achieve it. If you're able to bring those things in, that's why I talk about making good sense, because you're not only saying, don't feel this way or don't think this thing, but don't worry about this thing. We got it and I got it with you. Those are, for me, brilliant speakers are able to do that, regardless of the scenario. And I'm reminded, he won't mind me telling this story, but I was lucky to be in chambers with Oliver Blunt, QC as he then was KC, Emily Blunt's father. He was just an exceptional barrister. I mean, still is an exceptional barrister. I mean, he was just a powerful litigator, very strong, very physically strong, very determined. The way that he spoke was very powerful. He had a really strong voice, and it was just quite something to watch him in court. And unfortunately, I wasn't there. But when Emily Blunt got married to John Krasinski, he did a speech, which to all intents and purposes, and every version of facts that I hear, had the great and the good of Hollywood, like Meryl Streep's laughing, crying, sighing. Just he was able to just completely tailor a very specific advocacy style that he had to a wonderfully dramatic and empathetic father of the bride speech that captured the audience. And if you think about greatness, that that's what I'm talking about, the ability to just have those skills but then apply them in a way that just brings it to life to each audience. That's what greatness, I think, can look like.
What a delightful story. I can just imagine it. I'll add one thing that I think about sometimes, and it's coming out in what you're saying, for me at least, which is a really wonderful speaker. I think about the audience's experience. They experience that person. The audience wants to know you have them in your hands, that you've got them. There's nothing more awful when someone's on stage and it feels like something's going wrong and they're kind of losing it or they're worried. The audience, that sense of anxiety just pours through you. And you're like, oh my God, I hope they're okay. And that can be minor or quite extreme depending on the situation. But the audience wants to know that you have them with a sense of confidence and command, and yet the softness and vulnerability that can come with that confidence. And I think it's actually an analogy to the kind of leadership that's very effective today. How do you bring both a confidence and a sense of groundedness? I do a lot of yoga, so I get people up standing, grounded, rooted in the earth, bring the energy up and out. But that with that, you don't have to hold so tight. You can open your hands and be vulnerable too. So it's an interesting thing you're bringing up for me. But flipping the coin, there's a lot of people that do training out there, and I don't want to throw any of them under the bus. But in media training, and you kind of alluded to this, there's been a style of media training, especially over the decades that I've seen. And these are very great professionals, but a lot of them came out of broadcast news, often men, just because of that was the gender that was mostly in that harder hitting financial news, especially. And they tended to come in training like, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to show you how scary it is. I'm going to break you down. And I often say to a lot of my clients, hey, you have to understand that many of the most elite reporters are trained in the style of attorneys. They know how to do deposition style, which means they hand you a shovel and you start digging and you're at the bottom of the hole before you know it. Yet there are very few of my clients that will end up on the US show 60 Minutes or pick the equivalent on the BBC. So do you have a sense today of what some of those characteristics of trainers that you feel are well matched to this moment?
I mean, I absolutely share your internal or maybe external eye rolling. I have been in, the British experience, the British equivalent for that is you get a journalist who was I don't know, the ornithology reporter for the West Anglia Daily Times, who is now a media trainer and tried to some CEO of how to do, an annual report on a town hall, and you're thinking, what is happening here? But the real issue with that is this sort of emphasis on the what not to do. So much what not to do. And you think you spent 75% of the time telling me what I shouldn't be doing. What should I be doing? I'm hoping that those days are now in the rearview mirror. If not, they are getting to there. The media trainer of today, kind of coming back to your point and your question a little earlier, has to be training in a way that applies core skills that are then applicable in different scenarios. And of course, if you have the privilege of doing a half-day media training with an expert, putting them through their paces in different ways. I loved media training when I was in an agency, and I enjoyed the research that I needed to do to learn this expert set of skills so that I could show up well, to do practice runs, but then also giving feedback in a way that is actually useful. And I talk about feedback in the book quite a lot because there's a section specifically for PR pros, and I think this applies to media trainers generally, but PR people more on a day-to-day. How do you give feedback to someone who's new to this versus give good feedback to somebody who's more experienced? There is a difference. How do you provide feedback that is transferable so that can be used in a different way, so that there is not the need for ongoing support? You don't need another session because we're now not talking to Bloomberg, we're doing a fireside or we're doing a panel. You don't need to do another training. Hopefully the skills should be there. But then also developing a comp. And one of the most positive experiences I think I had in-house and also with long-term agency relationships is when you could have a set of speakers where you could do feedback, and it could be a word or a phrase or a key phrase, and that person knew exactly what you meant. You didn't have to go through all the theory again. You say, that was great, but redo point-proof anecdote structure. Or it could be something very, very simple in terms of the feedback, like pace. You don't have to go through chapter and verse of what you meant. They go, got it. And they would go again with the structure that you've taught them or with the keynote that you've taught them that they're able to apply. So I think media training has to really focus more on what to do, positive examples, good examples of what that looks like, good examples outside of their world to show them new things. I also see that there is a bit too much. We get this a lot. In professional services, for example, you get a lot of professional services firms that look at their brand and they want to become friendlier or softer or more approachable, for example, or whatever version of that they have, and which is the right thing to do for many professional services organizations when you think about the reputation of that industry. But then a trainer will show examples of other people within the industry, rather than say someone in a consumer-facing industry that is that bit more personal, is able to develop a business message, but in a way that is a little bit easier to understand or a bit more consumer-centric. Those are the examples we should be showing to say, okay, if you want to get a bit more like that, here are some good examples of what that looked like. And I particularly did that a lot in financial services, where these people were really in the weeds of financial services or fintech or banking, whatever it is, and go, I don't know, why do we listen to a retail interview? Why don't we listen to a non-profit interview? Something that is connecting to a different audience, but showing you those skills of how they can be applied and just softened ever so slightly to still be effective in the audience you have, but also impactful to the new audiences that you want to get.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful way of looking at it, because why should you be stuck just in your sector in that same box as everyone else? Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I mean, we literally could talk about these things forever. I've loved meeting you and getting into the book. So my final question often on our podcast is, what has you in its gravity today? Something fun. What do you have a passion for? What are you excited about right now in your life?
Well, I mean, if I'm allowed to pick two things, really, really briefly. First one, something that has me in my gravity right now is just having moved back to the UK recently. Just a story that's happening with the BBC right now. It's a really interesting story. I think for anybody on this podcast, anybody who works in comms, you should be looking at this and listening to what's happening as the BBC story evolves, what this might mean for reporting, how we think about reporting. When you consider, sorry to go there, you've got one side of the pond where you've literally got the president calling a journalist saying "quiet piggy" because of a question that's not asked, and we've all now moved on from that. Whereas the BBC,
I have not moved on from that, but please.
I feel like the media have moved on and we've just gone to what's the next thing, but we're really looking very forensically at the BBC story. And this is an organization that's even looking at itself and the way that it reports. And we've got people resigning or looking at this is a really interesting story for anybody. And I think it's going to have legs. And hopefully it's good for our industry that the media sort of holds itself a little bit more to account and readjusts over time. But ultimately, the BBC is such an important part of the British culture and institution that it'll be interesting to see what changes happen and how the BBC forms as part of that. On a more positive note, the other thing that's holding its gravity is a book, which is There Are Rivers in the Sky by Elif Shafak. And there are very few novels that I've read twice over. This is one of them. Not only is it just the most incredible novel, I mean, the weaving of storytelling from ancient Mesopotamia to modern day London and these people and these characters. If anybody wants to look at a masterclass in narrative and weaving together stories, read this book because it's just beautifully written, beautiful stories, and just such a wonderful concept. But I think it's holding me in its gravity also because ultimately the key theme of the book is about kindness. There is so much, and I've been really thinking about kindness a lot recently. Maybe it's part of my age, maybe it's part of my sentimentality, maybe it's just part of life. Thinking about, is what we're doing kind? Should we think more about us as organizations, even very commercial organizations? Are we speaking with kindness? Are we treating employees kindly? Are we treating each other with kindness? Can there be more? It's no longer a detractor from the business of business. I think to your point you talked about, we have tough decisions to make, we have tough feedback to give, but you can still be kind in doing that. And, it really even comes down to communications, not to get too deep into it, but you think of the Dalai Lama has always said, before you speak, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Kindness is very much part of how we speak to each other and how we should speak to each other. And it's just something I've been thinking about a lot. And the book has been a really good reminder of just a little bit more kindness every now and then can have such a positive impact on people's lives and the way that messages are delivered, even if it's bad news. So it's something we should all hold in our hearts, everything that we do in the world of work.
That's a wonderful recommendation. I co-sign on that very much. We are lacking in kindness and compassion right now. And the more we can reflect on that, the better. Well, Benjamin, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to be on Building Brand Gravity.
Thank you so much.